Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. All right, Gym Bros, Big Paul here today, and we're going to talk about insulin use a little bit. This is one where I think there's a lot of bad information that floats around on how to use insulin and what insulin's role is in bodybuilding. I usually steer away from this. I have some stuff up on the Anabolics e-course where I go into detail about insulin protocols. I kind of don't like talking about this one because most bros can't even calculate macros when it comes to diets, much less how many units of insulin they should take and how to keep an eye on their blood sugar. But I think there is some confusion on which insulin does what. And I see a lot of guys using Lantus in hoping to get gains out of it and performance enhancement. And Lantus doesn't really work that way. It's a basal insulin. I'm going to dig into how Lantus works and talk to you about that and how rapid-acting insulins work and why rapid-acting insulins are likely a better choice for performance enhancement. I'm not really sure where the whole Lantus thing came from. I have some thoughts on Lantus. I do use Lantus. I have type 1.5 diabetes. I have pancreatic insufficiency. So I have to use Lantus to replace my pancreatic output of insulin. I'm deficient in that area. Most people don't have that, so they don't really need Lantus for their bodybuilding purposes, but I'm going to talk about why. I am going to go into how insulin should properly be used. I'm not saying that you should use it, but how professional bodybuilders use it and why you see guys do it a certain way. And also my thoughts on why there's so many people using Lantus now. Before we dig into that, I do want to remind you about the Anabolics e-course. I have some detailed information in there on insulin use. I have also stuff, I'm putting up a new section on peptides. I'm slowly adding stuff there as well. Have a very detailed breakdown of how to do cycles, the blast and cruise methodology, also side effect mitigation and other things, PED profiles, etc. Kurt Havens and I have put this course together. There's over 60 hours worth of content on PEDs and 100 plus modules. I think it's the most in-depth PEDE course that you can find out there. I haven't found anything that has more content than this and more detailed content. So if you want to learn about PEDs, you want to go deep down the rabbit hole, you can go check out the Anabolics e-course. And we keep adding more stuff to it. I keep putting more things up there as I go along. And I find things that I think are interesting and people want to learn about. It gets added to the course. All right, enough of that, folks. We're going to dig into Lantus. We're going to talk about Lantus in just 1 second. All right, so let's talk about types of insulin and what they're used for. I'm very familiar with this. I'm a diabetic. I've been for quite some time. We have multiple types of insulin that do different things. A lot of people are using Lantus now. There's this notion that Lantus can somehow be a substitute for rapid-acting insulin like Humalog or Novolog, and they do very different things, and they're designed to do different things. Lantus is a basal insulin. There are other basal insulins, but the idea with Lantus is it's designed to replace the background insulin that's always present in your body. There is a baseline level of insulin that is always there throughout the day, even if you're keto. I hate to break it to you, keto and carnivore guys, insulin is still present in your body. You would die without it if it wasn't there. So you insulin make you fat bros. There's insulin in there even when you're not eating carbohydrates. Your body makes a small amount of insulin, something like a unit or two per hour, even when you're not eating carbohydrates. And when you have pancreatic insufficiency or type 1 diabetes where your pancreas just doesn't work at all, that you have complete loss of beta cell function, there is no baseline insulin present. And a basal insulin, i.e. baseline, like Lantus, we have Levemir is another type of baseline insulin that we could use as well. I think Levemir has a bit of a longer life. I don't recall exactly. I've always been on Lantus. Lantus is something like 20 to 24 hours of an active life with Lantus. Basal insulin does not peak. It stays level and it sort of tails off at the end. So I take 25 units of Lantus per day. That's what's prescribed to me by my doctor, 25 units of Lantus per day. It works out to be about 1 unit of Lantus of insulin per hour. Now, here's the thing. When you go and do your workout and you're doing your bro thing where you're eating 100 grams of carbs pre-workout, 50 intra, 100 post-workout, and you've got your 250 grams of carbs during that pre-intra and post-workout window, that insulin is not going to be enough to cover that. It's not going to be enough, especially if you're a type 1 diabetic or somebody with pancreatic insufficiency. This is where your rapid acting insulin, something like Humalog or Novolog, come into play, or an intermediate acting insulin. The rapid acting insulins like Novolog and Humalog give you a quick push of insulin that fades after something like 3 to 5 hours. Onset of Humalog, I'm looking at the diagram here for Humalog, is about 15 minutes. It peaks at 60 to 90 minutes, and then it tails off after 3 to 5 hours. So if you have diabetes, if you're a type 1 diabetic, you use Lantus to cover your background insulin, the baseline insulin that's always present, and then you use a rapid insulin to deal with meal times. Most of the time they are used together. You have your Lantus in the background, rapid-acting insulin that's used to deal with large boluses of carbohydrates. Now, what I've seen most gym bros do over the last decade or so is they've moved to using Lantus every day. If you have normal pancreatic function and you're throwing Lantus in the mix, there is this theory, I don't know if there's any justification to it, I've kind of come full circle on it, that potentially when you use Lantus, you're taking pressure off your pancreas and preventing long-term beta cell burnout. There is an argument to be made for that. I have seen some studies that potentially show that. But here's the thing with insulin, and I think a lot of times guys will use a basal insulin when they start to see their fasting glucose levels rise. I hear of dudes saying, I'm waking up with my glucose levels 115, 120, and I need to throw some Lantus in to deal with that. What that tells us, most of the time, if that starts to happen out of nowhere, is that we have some sort of underlying issue going on. That there might be some insulin resistance, potentially some beta cell burnout. And here's the problem with throwing more insulin at this problem and using a basal insulin to deal with high fasting glucose levels. You're masking the underlying problem. You're actually using more insulin to deal with the issue. So let's say your body is making a normal amount of insulin and you're throwing Lantus on top of it to force the issue when you're already insulin resistant. You get into this spiral where you're actually creating more insulin resistance. More insulin equals more insulin resistance and worsened metabolic disorders. And I think that's a huge mistake that a lot of guys are making. They're going about everything incorrectly. And not only that, if you think about this logically, if you're doing a large bolus of carbohydrates, say pre and post workout, or you're doing some sort of carb cycling diet, where you're having specific days during the week where you're pushing carbohydrates high to force glycogen synthesis, what is Lantus really going to do in that equation? If Like, let's say if you're running sort of a Milos-Sarcev style of protocol where you're banging a bunch of carbohydrates around your workout and you're forcing muscle protein synthesis and glycogen synthesis and all of the cool effects that happen from using insulin, increased IGF-1, increased mTOR, all of these other things that happen when you use insulin with carbohydrates around a workout window. What is if you're taking, like, for somebody like me, if you're taking 25 units of Lantus and you're eating 250 grams of carbs during that workout window, and you only have like 2 units of insulin present during that 2-hour window, what is that really doing? Is that going to help force the carbohydrates into the muscle? Is that really going to do anything additional, provide any additional benefit? It is not enough to deal with that huge bolus of carbohydrates if you're using insulin for performance enhancement. Now, like I said, one could make the argument that potentially that it is alleviating some pancreatic burnout, but it's not really providing any sort of performance enhancing effect other than keeping your glucose levels lower. And ultimately, we may be creating more insulin resistance by just pounding these basal insulins year round. It seems to be pretty commonplace with guys now, and I see a lot of guys that come to me for coaching and for consultations that have high A1Cs, that have high fasting insulin levels, the guys that have seem to be metabolically disordered and haven't taken an off season forever, and they're perma-bulking, their fasting glucose is on the rise. So they're using basal insulins to deal with it and just mask the underlying issue. That probably the more intelligent way to do things would be to carb cycle, or to take periodic breaks throughout the year where you diet down and get your insulin sensitivity back in place. Periods of time where you limit your exposure to insulin, because the more you're exposed to insulin, the more insulin resistance that you're going to have. It is true that forcing the issue with insulin, it works. I mean, it definitely works. I've seen it work. It's worked on me. I've seen Milos-Sarcev clearly has had success with his clients when he does it around the workout window. But you also have to keep in mind that there's a lot of other variables that are going on here. Like with Milos's protocols, I've seen them before. There's a high volume of workload that's happening during these workout windows that are helping shuttle these carbs and nutrients into the muscle when you're using insulin. If you're doing some sort of high intensity training where you're only doing a couple sets, the likely result from eating all these carbohydrates and taking insulin is just that you're going to become fat. And you'll see that all the time with guys. Guys will just say, I just got fat from taking insulin. Well, the reason you got fat is probably because your training and your diet didn't line up with the protocols that you're running. And I think a lot of times dudes will take insulin they think more is better, just like they would with PEDs. And insulin doesn't work that way. You need an appropriate amount to help with glucose disposal. And you have to keep in mind, if you're going to use insulin, that you need to be intelligent with your diet. You have to keep the fats low, and the carbohydrates need to be matched to the insulin intake, or actually the insulin intake needs to be matched to the carbohydrates that you use, so you don't go hypo. So you have to accurately measure everything with a glucose monitor. You have to know how your body responds to those things. If you're eating a bunch of fat around that window when you're using rapid acting insulin, you're just going to store body fat. Yes, you're going to have some glycogen synthesis, but when you're in a high carbohydrate state, any dietary fat that you eat is likely just going to be stored as adipose, and your body is going to prioritize those carbohydrates for fuel and for storage as glycogen. So any excess fats that are eaten during that window are going to be stored as fat, and you're just going to get fat. So that a lot of times when I hear dudes say, I just got fat when I ate insulin, or took insulin, not ate it, is just from shitty diet, shitty protocols. They aren't doing enough volume to actually facilitate any sort of nutrient uptake during the workout. And yes, you do have increased GLUT4 transport from lifting weights, and it doesn't seem to take a whole lot. And I know there's an argument to be made there that yes, you could probably just lift heavy and get sort of the stimulus, but I just have not seen it be the case. What I have seen is that if you are going to take insulin, if you're going to eat a shit ton of carbs, you need to do some volume to facilitate that nutrient transport effectively. That is another variable that a lot of guys don't consider when they're eating high carbohydrates and taking insulin, that their training needs to be dialed in to line up with that as well. Any of the dudes that you see that are taking insulin and getting bigger are almost always doing volume style of training with it. So, in summary, let's think about this thing critically. Lantus basal insulin is designed to replace your background insulin. If you are metabolically functional and your body is operating normally, you have sufficient pancreatic function, you don't have insulin resistance, your fasting glucose levels should be normal. If your fasting glucose levels aren't normal, then there's some sort of underlying issue that's going on that needs to be evaluated and treated appropriately. If it's insulin resistance, you probably need to go in a diet phase. There are other tools that you can use to help with it, things like berberine, metformin. Even now, it seems that things like retatrutide and GLP-1s help with metabolic disorders through different pathways. Those are other tools to use. But really, kind of the simple approach, if you want to get your insulin sensitivity improved, is to do a little more training volume. It's to go on a diet, do some cardio, get some weight off, and then your insulin sensitivity will be up. And you're going to be better able to use those carbohydrates. If you are going to put insulin into play, I know a lot of coaches like to put guys on Lantus and they just don't truly understand how it works. I think the reason why they tell guys to use Lantus is because bro wants to be on Slin, and Lantus is not, you're not likely not going to go hypo and die from taking Lantus. It's pretty hard to go hypo taking Lantus. 1 unit of insulin per hour is not going to kill you in most situations. I'm not recommending that you go out and do that, but it's unlikely. It's probably the safer way to go and tiptoe your way into insulin use. But you're not going to get the big performance enhancement benefits from it. You're not going to have that increased driving of nutrients into the muscle cell during the workout. One to 2 units per hour is not going to be enough to really do much of anything. You need a rapid acting insulin to really force the issue if that's what you're looking for. And if you're chronically using Lantus, there's definitely something else going on there. There's something going on with your insulin resistance and other issues. You guys just have this all twisted up and incorrect. Think of it this way. Lantus is sort of like the cruise control on your car. You set it and it stays steady. And if you want to pass another car, this is probably a shitty metaphor, but if you want to pass another car, or if you need a boost, you got to push the accelerator down. And that's what the rapid insulin does. All right, folks, that's all I've got for you on this one. Hopefully that clears up some confusion on rapid versus long-acting insulins, why most dudes are just wasting their time taking that rapid insulin or that long-acting insulin. And likely you're just creating more insulin resistance and making things worse if you are taking Lantus daily. If your blood sugar is high, fix the reason why your blood sugar is high. Don't throw another drug at it to fix the problem. That is something that drives me absolutely nuts. Guys, when they start having side effects and issues and manifestations of health problems, rather than adjusting the drugs that they're currently taking or fixing their diet or doing more cardio or losing some fat, they just throw more drugs at it. And eventually that catches up with you, your health declines, and you're not going to be able to sustain things, and that's not a sustainable approach. It's probably better to pull back, take a look at what the underlying problem is, and fix that problem. All right, folks, that's all I got for you on this one. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you. I'll see you next time. For coaching or consultations, head over to www.anabolicbodybuilding.com to book your spot today. I can help you with optimizing hormones, fat loss, muscle gain, physique, athletic performance, nutrition, and health. For more information, shoot me an email at bigp3rd@gmail.com.